Hello, welcome to session 6, the final session of the Welcome course. And this evening we are going to tackle the really important question of how should we live. We've seen a variety of angles on the Christian faith, and both doctrinal and practical, and now we come to put it all together and say, so what does this mean? What does this mean for how we live? And in the baptismal covenant, which you remember is the scheme which we're using to go through the course, we've come to the final two questions. Will you seek and serve Christ in all persons, loving your neighbor as yourself? And will you strive for justice and peace among all peoples and respect the dignity of every human being? In the group, we start this evening's session with an icebreaker, which is kind of whimsical. It's kind of funny. It also gets people thinking about ethics and morality, and it's a question, a series of questions that you're having coffee with a friend, and they mention 10 things to you, and they look for your advice, and you're kind of like having to advise them on what they should do in their circumstances. And what I'll tell you, which I don't tell them in the group, is that each one of these speaks to the 10 Commandments, or at least one of the 10 Commandments speaks to each of these different problems. So let's see if you can work out which one's which. I really like going to church. We have an amazing building, so peaceful and beautiful. I don't really pay any attention to what's happening. I can't stop thinking about the building. I know I should be listening and taking part, but I can't help it. My neighbor has just got a new car, really nice. Every time I pass their house, I wish I had it. It's stupid, but it actually makes me feel bad for ages. Last week, the girl in the gas station gave me $10 too much change. I kept it. Do you think that was okay? There's this person at work. We get on really well. I look forward to going to work now just so I can be with them. I'm attracted to them. I think they like me in that way too. Only problem is, they're married. What should I do? My boss picks on me. I hate him or her. I wish he or she was dead. I forgot to send my sister a birthday card. She got really upset on the phone. I told her that I sent one, but it must have got lost in the mail. It seemed to calm her down. Money's been tight lately with those college fees for our kid. I've stopped giving my full pledge to the church. God will understand, won't he? I inherited my dad's temper. I can't help it. It's all his fault. I have so much work right now, the only way I can do it is to go into the office on Saturday and Sunday afternoon. I haven't had a day off for months, and I feel guilty about it. I wasn't raised in a Christian home. Everyone in my family says God and Jesus as swear words. I do it too. Is that okay? So maybe you were able, as we went through those 10 situations, to think of which of the 10 Commandments addresses each of those. And the reason why we did a little kind of study there on the 10 Commandments will become obvious in a few moments' time. But first of all, when thinking about seeking and serving Christ in all persons, the first of those questions that we're looking at today, it begs the question of, well, how is Jesus present in every person? What does that actually mean? How can you tell? Well, Jesus is hiding in plain sight in the lives of human beings. In the Old Testament, it says in the book of Genesis that God created male and female in God's likeness. God created everyone in the image of God. Now, that's a profound statement, and we'll look at its consequences for ethics later in the session. But just to live with that for a moment, when we look at a person, what we're looking at is not just a piece of God's creation in the same way we look at a tree, although that's a wonderful creation too. But in Christian thinking, the person is not just another piece of creation. That person is made in God's own image, has the intrinsic dignity, respect, value of God in a way that the rest of creation doesn't possess. And in the New Testament, Jesus teaches that he is present in a really kind of unique and kind of shocking way. Here's a story he tells at the end of Matthew's Gospel. "Come, you that are blessed by my Father, inherit the kingdom prepared for you from the foundation of the world. For I was hungry, and you gave me food. I was thirsty, and you gave me a drink. I was a stranger, and you welcomed me. I was naked, and you gave me clothing. I was sick, and you took care of me. I was in prison, and you visited me." Then the righteous will answer him, "Lord, when was it that we saw you hungry and gave you food, or thirsty and gave you a drink? And when was it that we saw you a stranger and welcomed you, or naked and gave you clothes? And when was it that we saw you sick and in prison and visited you?" And the king will answer them, "Truly I tell you, just as you did it for one of the least of these who are members of my family, you did it for me." Now that's really quite shocking, isn't it? Because it says that Jesus is not just in just every person, but particularly focused in people who are suffering and in need in some way. So it makes me wonder, how much do we recognize Christ in other people? Particularly, how easy is it to spot Christ in people who are in need, in a homeless person, a hungry person, a person who is sick and suffering in some way? Because sometimes I find it not very easy to spot Christ in that person or see Jesus as that person. How hard is it to spot Christ in the person whose lifestyle we disagree with? Particularly at this moment, in this terribly tribal nation that we live in at the moment. How hard is it to see people in the other tribe, in the group of people that I kind of disagree with on maybe fundamental issues? How hard is it to spot Christ in a person I am angry with, or who is angry with me? These are difficult questions, and yet Jesus teaches that is where he is in every human being created in the image of God. So back to the Ten Commandments. And let me just sort of talk about for a moment, what are they actually for? We know what they are, largely. We can name, 3 or 4 just off the top of our head, perhaps. Maybe you can name all 10 if you're brought up in a very Christian kind of home. But what are they for? Because they're used in a variety of ways in our society. Well, first let me tell you what they're not for. They are not for displaying on the walls of courthouses or public buildings. That is how they are used in some states, particularly some in the South. But when you come to think about, the Ten Commandments and our legal system, actually there are only 3 of the Ten Commandments that are enshrined in the statute law of the United States. They are the ones about killing, lying, and stealing. And even the killing and lying ones are not illegal except in certain circumstances. It's okay, according to our constitution and our statute law, it's okay to kill people in certain circumstances, war being the obvious one. It's okay as well to lie. There's no law about lying except when it's under oath, in a court of law or in Congress or on a contract or something like that. It's okay to lie. There's no law about lying to your spouse or your kids or your friends. So the other 7, there's nothing at all in our constitution or laws. In fact, if you tried to enact any of the other 7, it would be pretty quick that someone would take you to the Supreme Court and that law would be declared unconstitutional. For example, the first 2 or 3 about having no other gods before God, having no graven images, keeping the Sabbath day holy. If you try to make laws about that, the separation of church and state, you can't do that according to our constitution. And in fact, at least one of them, the whole spirit of that commandment goes against our society, our social values, our norms, our economic system. The last one, thou shalt not covet, thou shalt not desire what other people have. Take that away, make a law against that, and suddenly overnight, the whole of our economic system grinds to a halt. So displaying them in public property and on courtroom walls really makes no sense. And they are not for trying to slavishly fulfill, partly because you can't succeed, and partly also because, as we looked at a previous week, it's not about law, it's about love. That's what the Christian life is about. But neither are therefore dismissing as irrelevant. The 10 Commandments still speak to us in these ways. They give us a glimpse of God's character. They show us that God is faithful, honest, kind, compassionate. All the things that the 10 Commandments try to legislate for is a vision of God. They give us a glimpse of our own moral shortfall as well. They show us how far we've missed the mark. And in that way, they help us turn to God. So that's the point of the 10 Commandments, not, to elevate as like this is how we should live. We don't do that. We live according to the law of love. You remember a couple of weeks ago we talked about there being 613 laws in the Old Testament, but Jesus narrowed them all down into just 2. Love God with all you've got and love your neighbor as yourself. Here's a question I want to just pose for you for a moment. Tonight's tricky question. What about other religions? We live in a multicultural, multi-faith environment, which most of us find to be quite exciting. Living on the edge of a big city is an exhilarating experience. We come into contact with people of different faiths and cultures. And personally, I love that, as I'm sure you do. But for a Christian, it kind of a thinking Christian at least, it does raise the question of so what's the standing of people who don't follow Christ, at least don't confess to following Christ, but follow some other path? What about them? Are they put right with God? Are they God's children? How do we work together? That sort of thing. So let me just sort of say a few points about this question. Again, this isn't like the definitive answer, but I just want to tell you how I feel about it and what I believe at the moment. This isn't what I've always believed, and it might not be what I believe in the future, but it's kind of where I'm at right now. There is a question that some people, or a statement that some people make, that, the Christian God is not the same as the Jewish God or the Muslim God. And to which I want to say, well, how many gods are there? You know, I'm a Christian. I believe there's one God, and therefore there's one God. So, is the Muslim God the Christian God? Well, if there's only one God, then yes, of course. There's only one God. So the God of Muslims is the God of Christians. So it's not really the right question, is that the same God? Because if there's only one God, then the answer is yes, logically. In other words, that's just not the right question. There are better questions. So there is one God, and God reveals God's self. God reveals the truth to human beings. Always has, always will, through a variety of media. So we can't work God out. We can't, get to God, do some kind of formula, some kind of deep thinking that will somehow, we get our way to God. God has to reveal God's self because, we are so puny and so finite that we need that revelation. We're not going to work God out for ourselves. So God reveals the truth of God's nature in a variety of different ways, including to the Old Testament people of God. God shows himself, his character, through the Ten Commandments, through prophets who would go up to people in power and say, stop abusing the poor, stop taking advantage of people, do justice, have humility, love people, love the poor, give equality. That's the kind of the message of the prophets. So God's revealing God's self through the written law and through the prophets, but only partially. We get glimpses of God in the Old Testament. We come to see what his character is like in part, but we come to see God fully in Christ. That's what I would say as a Christian. So all those hints about God, the incomplete picture we get in the Old Testament, suddenly with the arrival of Jesus, God's saying, look, if you want to know what I'm like in fullness, here I am. And I've talked about it before as being like a wedge. At the thin end of the wedge is the beginning of the Old Testament. At the thick end of the wedge is Jesus. And as we go through the Bible, through the Old Testament, we get a bit more of God and a bit more of God till suddenly we get the full revelation of God, which is the man Christ, who is God incarnate. And Jesus talked about himself being the fulfillment of the Old Testament. So he fills up the vision of the God in the Old Testament in a way that the Old Testament could not do because it lacked Christ. So in that way, Jesus says that he came to fulfill the Old Testament religion. Now, I want to say that by implication, therefore, God fills up all religion and philosophy. All religion and philosophy is an attempt to reach God. So whether it's a religion, a philosophy, thinking, art, literature, science, all of human endeavor, as I've said before, is this attempt to get back to the perfection which is God. The attempt to return to Eden, to make connection with the transcendent. So that's what it's all about. That is what the human condition is about. The human endeavor, the human experience is about trying to get our way back to Eden, to get in connection and union with God. So Jesus, I would say as a Christian, is the fulfillment of all of those attempts by human beings to reach God. So all faiths are an attempt to reach God, and so they're not wrong, Jesus fulfills the Old Testament faith. He also, I would say, fulfills all other faiths. So, you come across Jewish Christians, Hindu Christians. I have friends back in England who are Sikh Christians. People who are brought up within their faith tradition, who came to see that for them, Jesus kind of completed their faith, They still practice many of the cultural parts of the faith they were brought up in, but now see that Christ is part of that faith, and they worship him within the context of their culture. Now, I think that's quite a helpful thing, and it doesn't sort of rule out people retaining their cultural identity, but at the same time seeing that Christ being the fulfillment of their faith. So in other words, other religions are not wrong. They're just, from my perspective, not complete because they lack that full revelation of Christ. Now, which means we can be with people of other faith, we can do things with them, because on many, many things we will absolutely agree. And where we don't necessarily agree, well, that's okay. This doesn't mean that we have to kind of hate each other and be violent towards each other. Quite the opposite. We look at each other with compassion because we're all searching for the same thing. But as a Christian, I say, we've had that extra bit of revelation, which is the man Christ, the fullness of God, and that's how we enter fully into an understanding of who God is and how we enter fully into relationship with God. People who've never heard of Christ, let's just say, God judges people according to the way God judges people. And none of this is to rule out people of other faiths still being right with God in a kind of a salvation kind of way. That's God's business, not mine. So the other question tonight, will you strive for justice and peace among all people and respect the dignity of every human being? Now, this is a really interesting question, and I love it. I particularly love the dignity of every human being aspect, which clearly stems, fully from that concept of people being made in God's image. So, what this means, the dignity of human beings, is that Christians will always challenge ideas and movements and policies that undermine human life. And that could be all manner of things, from demonic philosophies like racism, Nazism, Marxism, the kind of philosophies that just, result in the deaths of human beings, or turning human beings into something less than they really are, which is, the fullness of God, the image of God. So, for example, there have been a huge number of Christians throughout church history who, with a full sense of the dignity of human beings, have worked to overturn unjust structures. So in the country of my birth, someone like William Wilberforce, a Christian, just powerfully motivated to end the slave trade, and could not exist without being driven, propelled in British politics, in Parliament, to year after year after year try to do away with slavery, which he eventually succeeded in doing in the very early 19th century. Churches who have stood up against ruthless governments, the Confessing Church in Germany in the 1930s, Catholics in Poland during the communist years of that country, the class system in India, which relegated some people to being untouchable and unworthy. The end of apartheid in South Africa, where the Anglican Church, our own church, was at the forefront of bringing about the end of that, sinful, racist system of structuring society. So the immense worth of every human being, the balloon debate that we had. Who are you going to throw out of the balloon? The answer is nobody. We don't place, one individual as being more worthy of life than another individual. They are all equal. And this concept, the sanctity of human life, this is a key concept. It's a concept which, we're grateful to the Roman Catholic Church for doing so much work on. The concept has its roots in Roman Catholic history, and it's taken really as the foundation to all Roman Catholic social teaching on economics, on war and peace, on social justice, the way countries organize themselves, societies organize themselves. The Roman Catholic Church has taken that principle of the sanctity of human life and done a really amazing job of applying it in practical human enterprises. So this means that for devout Roman Catholics, all attacks on human life are wrong and sinful. This includes things like abortion, euthanasia, capital punishment, genocide, torture, the direct and intentional targeting of non-combatants in war, and every deliberate act of taking life. Malcolm Muggeridge, who I mentioned last week in the context of suffering, says this. He was a very devout Catholic, and this was his comment. This life in us, however low it flickers or fiercely burns, is still a divine flame which no man dare presume to put out, be his motives never so humane and enlightened. To suppose otherwise is to countenance a death wish. Either life is always and in all circumstances sacred, or intrinsically of no account. It is inconceivable that it should be in some cases the one and in some the other. So very logical. You can see that follows in a very rational sense. You can see his argument, and very difficult to argue against in terms of logic. That some people, that their lives are sacred, and other people, their lives are not sacred. So how do we, as Episcopalians, respond to this? Well, my response, and it is my response, because I think various people will have different positions than I do on this. But my response is to take the Catholic root of the sacredness of life, but also to hold that in a pragmatic way, and to say that life is full of grey. Life is more complex than sometimes we make it. It's very scarce. Very rarely is life a choice between a good option and a bad option. Sometimes we have to make a choice morally, ethically, between two bad options. And I would look at war in that light. Is war right? Is war good? Is war holy? Well, no. To all of those, war is unholy. War is sin. War is always wrong. However, sometimes not going to war, allowing the status quo to exist, is also wrong. The classic example being, Nazism in Europe in the 1930s, and in the Far East in the 40s. So, was going to war wrong? Yes. Was not going to war wrong? Yes. So then, this is a bit more complex than we thought. The sanctity of human life, yes, it means we don't intentionally take lives, but does that mean we stand back and do nothing as people take other people's lives. Well, where do we come down on this? And I think most Christians would say that in some circumstances, yes, it is justifiable to take a human life. And in the case of war, the Second World War is the classic example, to my mind. I don't believe that in my lifetime there has been another armed conflict that the United States or the United Kingdom have been involved in that justifies the taking of life. I don't know of one. The Second World War, to me, is the epitome, and nothing else quite gets to that point. So that's what I would say. I would say that, yes, life is sacred. It is wrong to take a life, but in some circumstances, it is more wrong not to take a life. And the Second World War is the example, I think. This also touches on life before birth. I would say, and this is my personal opinion, that sometimes the taking of a human life, an unborn human life, yes, it's wrong, but it is less wrong, possibly, than the alternative. That separates me from Christians who are very absolutist in their statement that abortion is wrong. But it also separates me from some other people who would say, abortion in any circumstances, that's the business of the mother, and you can't call it right or wrong. It's up to her. Can you see? This is tricky stuff. And let me say that this is an equal opportunities offender. Okay, people on, Christians on the left and right are challenged equally by this. Christians on the left are challenged by the implications for abortion and euthanasia. Okay, if every life is sacred, even unborn life, and even life that is close to death, then, that's a challenge if you are on the left of our political spectrum. For those on the right, this is also a challenge because it has huge ramifications for things, for life after birth, for issues of poverty, equality, not just in America, but around the world, for war and peace, dovishness and hawkishness. It has ramifications for people's access to health care. It has ramifications for, closing the gap between the rich and the poor. So when you might hear someone say, I'm a pro-life Christian, well, are you really? Because life is not just about what happens before you're born, it's about what happens after as well. And those on the right are just as challenged by the sanctity of life as those on the left. But in our political debate at the moment, sanctity of life has, tragically been reduced to just one issue, namely abortion. What the sanctity of life does not mean is that we preserve life at all costs. Okay? It is anybody's right, both legally and morally, to refuse treatment and to die if they have a terminal illness. There is no moral problem with that whatsoever. In fact, it is immoral to keep someone alive against their wishes if withdrawing treatment would mean they died. Supreme Court is very clear on that, and I think Christian ethics is very clear on it as well. So the sanctity of human life does not mean that we can't turn the life support machine off or withdraw the feeding tube. These things are not unethical, they're not immoral. You may work in the healthcare industry and be kind of really like at the front end of this, and the advancements that we've had in medical technology mean that we face ethical decisions that they didn't have generations ago, and this is one of them. but the sanctity of human life does not mean that we can't allow people to die if that is what they wish. So God's sovereignty over life must not be usurped. We don't get to choose how long this person lives. That's God's. That's for God to decide. And preserving life extends to providing the means of its preservation. All right. So that's the challenge to those on the right. This is about access to healthcare. It's about poverty. It's about giving people a healthy, sustainable lifestyle in a planet which is also sustainable. All of that is a life issue. Global warming is a pro-life issue. Climate change is a life issue if it means that Bangladesh is going to be permanently underwater in 100 years' time. Clearly, that's a pro-life issue. If we're pro-life, we've got to do something about that. So, finally, for the course, I just want to talk very briefly about the Episcopal, a bit more Episcopal kind of housekeeping, if you like. And particularly the calendar that we use in the Episcopal Church. When you come to church, you no doubt hear that Sundays are called different things, and the clergy wear different colours. And we have a 12-month calendar, and here it is. The start of the church year is Advent, and this is the 4 Sundays before Christmas. It began on the 1st of December 2019. The next season is Christmas, and it is 12 days, beginning on the 25th of December. Then, at the end of that, the 13th day is January the 6th, and that is the Epiphany, we call it, when Jesus was encountered by the Magi, representing Gentiles, the whole earth, coming to recognize Christ. Then the next big season is Lent, which is the 40 days before Easter. This year, it begins on February the 26th. And that's a time for Christians to reflect on themselves, to undergo, some discipline of prayer, of self-control, of renunciation of things, if that's what they want to do. Because we're thinking about Jesus and his preparation to die. Then, at the end of Lent, there is Easter. Easter Day this year is the 12th of April. And it lasts 7 weeks, Easter. And it's followed immediately by Pentecost, which is the coming of the Holy Spirit, this year on the 31st of May. And everything in between that is ordinary time. There it is as a circle, and there are the colors. Okay, so when you come in and the clergy are wearing purple, it's Advent or Lent. Purple is a somber kind of color, a color of kind of reflection and calm. So those 2 seasons of waiting and self-examination, purple is the obvious color for that. Gold or white, colors of celebration and lavish splendor, and Christmas and Easter are the times we wear those. Red, the color of blood and fire, we wear those just a couple of Sundays a year. Palm Sunday, when Jesus comes into Jerusalem, the week before Easter, and Pentecost, when the Holy Spirit came to the church in tongues of fire, blood and fire, red. So those are those 2 days. And everything else, we wear green, which is the color of nature, the color of ordinariness, the color of life. So green fills it in, and you see that, half the year we are wearing green. So that's pretty much all I would like to say to you. Thank you so much for taking part in this course. If you have any questions about the faith perceived through Episcopal eyes, then do please talk to me. Send me an email. Let's get together and talk. what happens now? Well, if you would like to go forward with a step of commitment, we have a confirmation service coming up in May. That's a time when people who have not been confirmed can express their own personal faith and take on for themselves the baptismal vows which were made on their behalf. And it's a time when people who have been confirmed in another church, like the Roman Catholic Church, can officially join the Episcopal Church. Not by being confirmed again, but by being received by the bishop when he visits in May. So talk to me about that if that's something that interests you. But thank you for taking part and for listening, and I'll see you very soon. Bye-bye.